Anyone who studies music will eventually come across the concept of augmented sixth chords, of which there are three types: the Italian, German, and French sixth. Instead of doing what most theory teachers do, which is to dryly explain each one of these and how they resolve without giving much further info on them, I would like to in this video discuss only one of them, this being the German sixth, and how just understanding when it's employed does not always give an absolute truth for when it should actually be used, as there are cases where it for all intents and purposes should be used if we follow the dry rules we learn in music school, but yet isn't, for which there are also very good reasons. So if you're new to this topic, what is an augmented sixth chord? Well, simply put, it is a chord that contains an augmented sixth interval. So in the case of a German sixth chord, the simplest construction of it is a major triad with an augmented second stacked above the fifth of the triad. This augmented second in turn creates an augmented sixth in accordance with the lowest note of this chord. This chord can be inverted however one pleases, whereby the augmented sixth is only ever present in this inversion of the chord. So although most theories say that this chord basically doesn't have a proper root like the diatonic triads or seventh chords do, it does perhaps have a root position, which is this position wherefrom the chord gets its name. If you were to play this chord devoid of any greater harmonic context, it sounds exactly like a dominant seventh chord. So the question arises, why in the case of this German sixth, built in this example above the note C, do we write an A sharp instead of a B flat, when the resulting chord sounds exactly the same as a dominant seventh chord? The answer is in how the German sixth resolves, which is not the same as a dominant seventh chord. With a dominant seventh with B flat, we can resolve to its respective tonic, the F major triad, or deceptively to either D minor or D flat major. But what if we want this chord to go somewhere else, like, say, E minor? Well, if we left the current dominant seventh spelling, the orthography becomes not only somewhat messy with B flat resolving to B natural, but also the dominant seventh is no longer fulfilling its purpose as a dominant chord, but rather is merely functioning as a chromatic stepping stone to another harmony. Therefore, the B flat is written as an A sharp to indicate it is moving chromatically to the B natural of the next chord. Another reason is that chordal sevenths typically resolve stepwise downwards in the rules of harmony. Therefore, having the chordal seventh of B flat resolve up to B natural is typically not acceptable, which is remedied by changing the spelling of the interval to that of an augmented sixth, and augmented sixths like to resolve upwards. While the German sixth resolves best in this fashion, where the augmented sixth resolves to the fifth of a minor triad, the augmented sixth can also resolve to the root of a major triad. But in the case of the German sixth, this creates a risk of having parallel fifths, which may or may not be a bother, considering Mozart used parallel fifths, which resulted from the German sixth. So it's safe to say they're one of those tolerated exceptions. But all of this is bringing me to a musical progression that I quite fancy, that stems from the theory behind the German sixth, but in practice doesn't use the German sixth at times. This might seem strange, so let me try to explain. The progression I am referring to is something called the Voglersche Tonkreis in German, which translates roughly to Vogler's tone circle, in reference to the theorist Georg Joseph Vogler, who first published this progression in his treatise Tonwissenschaft und Tonsetzkunst. However, I rather prefer to call this progression by its German nickname, the Teufelsmühle, which translates to the devil's mill, for no other reason than it being more entertaining to say. So what is this progression, and how does it stem from the German sixth, without necessarily using it? So to find the origins of this progression, let's start with a cadential 6/4 resolution in, say, E minor. Preceding the 6/4 chord of E minor, we can use a myriad of chords, but if we want a chromatic approach to the 6/4, we can, for example, either use an A-sharp diminished 7th chord to ascend chromatically to the E minor 6/4 chord in the bass, or the German 6th built on a C to descend into the cadential E minor 6/4. We can take this a step further by combining both of these chords and ascend chromatically through the 6/4 chord, and that we move from the diminished 7th to the 6/4 chord and then on to the augmented 6th chord, whereafter we can end the phrase with the same cadential 6/4 as before. And entertainingly, this progression is reversible, as it can start with the German 6th, move to the 6/4, then to the diminished 7th, and then into the cadential 6/4. This leads us to an interesting situation, whereby we can continue this progression chromatically almost indefinitely. If, for example, we take the descending version of this phrase, whereby we can just keep cycling through the chromatic sequence of German 6th to 6/4 to diminished 7th, and continue the following chromatic bass, and then recommence the same exact pattern with a German 6th to 6/4 to diminished 7th, etc., we can essentially keep this going as long as we want. And as it works with a descending bass line, it also works the same way in reverse with an ascending bass line. This is where we have begun to enter what is called the Devil's Mill, a progression one can enter or exit freely at any starting point, either if one lands on a 6/4 chord, diminished 7th, or a dominant 7th one wishes to respell as a German 6th, and therefore continue from that point onwards as the progression dictates until you wish to exit it again. In total, the theorist Vogler mapped out the entire series in this circle, whereby there are 14 sets of these 3-chord groupings, with 42 chords in total. But there is a caveat to all of this. When one enters the Devil's Mill, most composers just don't bother employing the German 6th at all, and write a dominant 7th, because it's cleaner and easier to read, and one isn't forced to fuss around with as many unnecessary enharmonic changes as one would be forced to do with German 6ths. Therefore, the rule should be seen as such. If only cycling, ascending or descending through the first 3 chords of this progression and tying off the ending with a cadential 6/4, the German 6th can be used. But if a composer wants to actually start using the Devil's Mill beyond one 3-chord grouping and continue the phrase outside of that, they are better served by just spelling those German 6ths as dominant 7ths. This is one of those realms where the apparent strict rules that apply to the spelling and resolution of dominant 7ths have their exceptions. In fact, Vogler does not even notate augmented 6ths in his demonstration of the Devil's Mill, and this convention holds in much of German music literature, such as in Schubert's Lied Der Wegweiser. The same situation is found in Haydn's Die Schöpfung. Both of these examples exhibit how the Devil's Mill manifests in actual music, whereby it can be entered whenever one lands on a 6/4 chord, diminished 7th, or dominant 7th. And as all of these chords have very strong pulls to their own respective resolutions, this progression can be entered and exited with enormous ease, which is why I consider it one of those fun little tricks a composer can use to go somewhere quite harmonically different quickly and smoothly without jarring the listener too much. Of course, the devil's mill should be used sparingly, like a potent spice while cooking, as no one wants to hear an infinite loop of ascending or descending chromatic chords in your piece. But nonetheless, jumping into the progression for 4, 5, 6, or even 7 chords can take you interesting places. So have fun with it, and if you are interested in more of this kind of instruction based off of old music sources, be sure to become a channel member to gain access to exclusive lessons.